name is Andrea Fowler. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for South Asia and one of the co-chairs of the Wisconsin International Resource Consortium here at UW-Madison. And it is my extreme pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Rumya Putcha. Rumya Putcha is an associate professor at the Institute for Women's Studies, as well as at the Hugh Hodgson School of Music at the University of Georgia. Her research interests center on colonial and anti-colonial thought, particularly around constructs of citizenship, race, gender, sexuality, the body, and the law. Her first book, The Dancer's Voice, Performance and Womanhood in Transnational India, which was released by Duke University Press 2023, develops a transnational feminist approach to Indian performance cultures. And her second book project, Namaste Nation, Orientalism and Wellness Cultures in the United States, extends her work on transnational performance cultures to critical analyses of capitalist fitness industries. And I have had the great pleasure of hearing bits and pieces of this research in its various stages, and I think you're going to take a lot away from today's talk, which is titled Orientalism and Wellness in the United States. And I will hand it over to Rumya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fowler and the Center of South Asia for having me back. This project actually began in a talk I gave there back in, we were trying to do the math, 2018, I think we decided, 2017, something like that. I am in a slightly odd place right now, so please forgive me. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you just get like a thumbs up? All right, great. Let's see if I can make, I'm on a laptop that I don't usually use, so hopefully we'll meet any technical difficulties sharing my screen. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Screen. Nice. Right. All right, we're gonna try this. Hopefully it will work. How does that look to y'all? Great.
That looks great.
Technology working for me for once. Amazing. All right. So thank you again to Dr. Fowler for having me back as a IS to talk about this research in progress. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to hearing what you think and thinking through some of these issues together. My presentation today is based primarily on my ethnographic research on yoga industries and is excerpted from a larger project that interrogates the entrenched connections between yoga and Orientalism in the North American context. The questions I want to focus on today in my time with you all are, what can yoga and its prescriptions for a good life tell us about the processes and practices of settler colonialism? And related, what is the relationship between a good life and wellness? To try and answer these questions in my work, I compare and contrast the two primary narratives surrounding yoga today. First, that it is an ancient Hindu philosophy which originates from the area today known as India. And second, that it is a wellness and exercise regimen popular among a majority white and female or female identified demographic in public space. Today, I'll be focusing on ethnographic research that I conducted recently in Boston and in Chicago, and I'll touch briefly on some other examples before I close. Before I get into the ethnographic research, though, it's important to lay some groundwork. In the larger project, I explore how forms of capitalist engagement established during the colonial era and in the name of what many have examined as a white man's burden have today become popular and legible in and as white public space. The phrase white man's burden is one I am sure many in the audience are familiar with as a reference to imperialism and its Orientalist and racist logics. However, some might be surprised to learn that the phrase was originally coined to justify North American settler colonial projects in the 19th and 20th century. Political cartoons like this one, for example, capture the gendered logics of burden and colonial modernity, specifically the idea that colonizers were transporting colonized people and their cultural practices to a better, more civilized, and for our purposes today, a good life, represented here by a woman. It's kind of hard to tell, but the far, I guess, maybe left of your screen, the word civilization, there's the woman seated underneath that. It is this gendered and rather patronizing notion of a good life that I will examine today as a defining example of Orientalist thought, but also a hallmark of settler colonial logics. It is worth also drawing our attention here to the armband worn by Uncle Sam in this satirical drawing. Put mildly, the idea of health and wellness dispatched by the masculinized state is tied up in both Orientalism and its civilizational projects. My goal in bringing the idea of Orientalism into conversation with wellness not only speaks to what yoga is and how it has become so popular in the North American setting, but also asks for whom and by whom yoga has become what we recognize today as yoga. In posing these reorienting questions, my research is informed by the critical recognition that neither colonialism nor Orientalism are mechanisms of the past, nor are they geographically specific to Euro-American ideologies of empire and difference, as political cartoons very clearly depict. Today, and especially in the North American context, Orientalist thought is simply so domesticated that it can circulate through apolitical critiques of neoliberalism and abstracted individualist rhetoric like the idea of the good life. In making this argument, I am drawing on the insights of cultural theorists like Stuart Hall. Speaking about social relations in capitalist societies, Hall reminds us that the relations of capitalism can be thought of as articulating the levels or instances of the social formation, economic, political, and ideological. Race is thus also the modality in which capitalism is lived, the medium through which capitalist relations are experienced, the form in which it is appropriated and fought through. So, extending Hall's insight here, there is no examination of capitalism and how capitalist logics have shaped what yoga is or does to transport one to a good life without a critical analysis of colonialism and race. In the North American setting, where the vast and overwhelming majority of yoga consumers and practitioner identify as belonging to the white race, and thus are also more often than not cisgendered women, this means that we have to have the language to understand how the story of whiteness and or womanhood is also the story of yoga. It was this awareness that brought me to conceptualizations of white public space as something that yoga is uniquely responsible for creating and sustaining. I should pause at this juncture to talk just a little bit about what I mean by white public space and what it might have to do with the ideas of the good life that we're discussing today. Theories of white public space emerge from sociological, legal, and anthropological research. Linguistic anthropologists like Jane Hill theorize white public space as that which is achieved through a social order which normalizes white speech habits. In the ethnographic examples I am about to present, the role of language and sound more generally to establish power relations is certainly prominent, but these power relations are not specific to language or speech. Rather, they extend to a much larger and broader implication of how people experience and communicate their positionality in public spaces. To help you understand what I mean by this, I'd like to now turn to some recent ethnographic research I conducted 2 summers ago now in Chicago, Illinois. So Chicago has recently instituted a summer ritual called Sundays on State Street. And I'd be looking forward to hear if I have any Chicagoans in the audience here today. I suspect I might. If you are familiar with State Street, specifically the parts of it that are south of the river, north of the river tends to become a more affluent area. South of the river is less so. And the areas that this event happened are arguably still majority Black areas. This fieldwork was conducted right after vaccines rolled out, right after the world started to kind of come back to in-person interactions, still primarily outdoor, of course. And I was not intending to be there for this, I should admit. I sort of stumbled upon it. I was doing, in my ethnographic work, I try to map where yoga studios often are found in cities. So I was just walking and trying to see where the yoga studios were in the loop. And I stumbled upon this, and lo and behold, they were doing yoga in the middle of the street. And State Street, again, for those who may not be from Chicago, is a pretty big thoroughfare. So to shut it down to do something like this is not a small undertaking. There's a few things I could say about it, but in the interest of time, I think the highlights are there was a posh studio that was contracted, a posh studio being a studio from a fairly nice neighborhood in Chicago from the north side that was contracted to lead this event. This event, again, as I mentioned, is happening in a less affluent area and in a majority Black, or moving towards more majority Black neighborhoods. And of course, so that begged the question to me, what were the demographics of those who were participating? You can't maybe tell very well from this picture, but it was majority white. And to my understanding, I did not speak with many of the participants. I only spoke with two. They both identified as women. It's not pictured here, but so I stayed and I watched a few sequences. And as I was watching it, I noticed that there was a unhomed Black woman standing on the sidelines trying to participate in this event. And, ethnography, if I have any ethnographers in the audience, I suppose there will be some who might identify with this. There are often moments when you're not sure if it's the appropriate time to approach somebody and talk to them about why they are there. And if I could go back in time, I might have handled that moment differently. But when this woman noticed me watching her trying to participate in the event, she stopped. She sort of stopped doing what she was doing. And so I didn't think it was appropriate to approach her. But I am struck by what I saw there. This is a public event. It's meant to be for anyone. But what I very clearly saw was somebody who perhaps actually lived on that street did not feel that that was her space to participate in. So that moment has left me wondering who these events are for, what they mean, what their intentions are, what their motivations are for actually engaging the public, who is the public. So this is just a snapshot of more recent ethnographic work. I'd like to say a little bit about work that I've done that I've actually developed into more of an argument. Oh, I see a comment. Yeah, I can't wait to talk about this in the Q&A. I need to come back and see if they're continuing to do it, or if this was like a COVID thing that only happened during that time. But what I will say, in the over a decade now of sort of tracking yoga in public spaces, is moments like this do not surprise me anymore. The people who feel that yoga is theirs are a very specific subset. And yeah, I'll stop there and I will give you a few more examples. So the one I had spent the most time studying before COVID was actually yoga in museums. I started tracking the trend of museums including yoga classes in their official programming in 2018, when this article appeared in the New York Times. It might be an obvious statement, but I suppose I should flag it. Namaste as a term has become sort of inextricably linked to yoga at this point. So I have also gone through a process of sort of tracking that term as it appears in the vernacular. So this article, for example, articulated a belief that in the museum, as a space where wellness practices like yoga, quote, mirror the aesthetics or philosophy of their collection, end quote. Today, museums across the world use similar rhetoric to advertise the museum space as a public space that lends itself to yoga, meditation, and other rejuvenating practices. So here are just a few examples. This is the West Australian Museum in Perth. Yoga under fossils. This is the Brooklyn Museum. And this is the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where I did some ethnographic research on their yoga programming. So in my research in Boston, I have learned that the space of the museum as an established philanthropic and public space signals and signposts ideas of both travel and tourism, but also empathy. That word shows up a lot in the programming. Beyond the mirroring that allows participants in museum yoga programs to feel emotionally connected or empathetic with the artwork and its historicity, the space of the museum arguably fuels a different kind of attachment too, that of expansiveness. Something that I've noted, and you perhaps noted in these images, is how large these spaces are, how high the ceilings are, sort of how monumental these spaces are meant to seem. So something that I've been thinking about is how that idea of monumentality is also wrapped up in the way that yoga has come to participate in these public spaces and how it links public space to the people who identify with those public spaces. And can't help but maybe offer a hat tip here to Benedict Anderson, who I've returned to in thinking through these issues, who observed that public spaces operate as both representations and as monuments, often imbued with gravitas and legacy, but also notions of domination and entrenched imperial forms of engagement between people and the material world. In the nearly 40 years since Benedict Anderson commented on the role of the museums within the larger imperial project as evidence of an overactive racial imagination, white public spaces have become ever more visible, illuminating the style of thinking about domains. The warp of this thinking is a totalizing classificatory grid, which can be applied with endless flexibility to anything under the state's real or contemplated control. I'm thinking here, of course, of the State Street example that I presented you. Peoples, regions, religions, languages, products, monuments, and so forth. The effect of the grid was always to be able to say it was this, not that. It belonged here, not there. Anderson's observation about how some people conceive of who belongs where, and therefore what is or is not theirs, captures the limits of examining yoga as an individual act and brings me to perhaps my last example for today and my most expansive ethnographic field site, Instagram. And forgive me, I was hoping to be able to do a fancy animation here and like show you all these examples one by one, but I'm on someone else's computer. It's not going to happen. So these are just a few examples of hashtag yoga, hashtag namaste, and other sort of related. Another one is yoga every damn day. There's a few more. And of course, yoga wellness shows up a fair bit. I wish I had had time to look and see if the good life also tracks with these. That is something that perhaps I can do after this and report back if I'm able. So social media ethnography and hashtag ethnography are methods developed by anthropologists like Sarah Pink, Jonathan Rosa, Yaramar Bonilla, to name only a few, to better understand how public spaces like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and more recently, Parler and TikTok foster forms of community and space. I have been following the hashtag Namaste as well as a collection of others which overlap and aggregate on Instagram for about the last 8 years. For example, in my research on museum yoga at the MFA, I tracked hashtags like hashtag museum yoga or hashtag Namaste Saturday, which is the name of the event. There's a lot more work to be done on how the era of smartphone technology and more recently the move to virtual during COVID overlaps with social media spaces and shapes what yoga is and does to signal the good life in the contemporary moment. In the context of my larger project, though, social media landscapes are but one example of how whiteness shapes notions of the public and space, and I would argue, the good life. Put another way, yoga as a public activity in majority white spaces becomes a way to track and trace how yoga and what qualifies as yoga has changed. How yoga today signposts new emotional attachments, how notions of burden, the white man's burden, the first slide, today have been recast as eco or volunteer tourism or spirituality. So in lieu of a conclusion today, I'd like to lead us maybe into a discussion and just close with a restatement of the questions I opened with. What can yoga, oh, these are examples I wanted to show you. Maybe I'll come back to that during the Q&A, but these are sort of more recent examples. I will come back to that at the end. What can yoga, especially commercial yoga and wellness industries, which now extend to selling everything from Tibetan sound baths to craft brewed chai, tell us about the processes and practices of forming a good life? And what is the relationship, especially in terms of commodities, goods, and people, between a good life and wellness? I know I've run a little short, Andrea, I hope that's okay, but I'd like to stop there and hopefully have a discussion. Thank you so much for having me.